She wore her plainest dress to meet her father's guest. She did not know he was the Duke. Autumn arrived at Harrowden Hall that year not as a season, but as a creditor. It came for the elms first, stripping them coin by coin from their branches until the avenue lay carpeted in a slow, bronze accounting. It came for the light, calling in the long afternoons of summer with a cold, businesslike wind that moved through the hedges as though it had a list. It came for the roof, where the slates had begun to loosen at the west chimney. It came for the pantry, where the flour bin no longer reached its usual line. And it came, at last, for the ledgers in Sir Edmund Whitcombe's study, and for the girl who counted them. That girl was Louisa Whitcombe, 22 years old, quiet-featured, quiet-voiced, and quiet in her habits, and she had been counting her father's ledgers, one candle's tub at a time, since she was 15. She did the counting after the household had gone to bed, because Sir Edmund did not know she did it, and because her elder sister Charlotte would have laughed at her for it, and because in the whole of Harrowden Hall there was no one else who would. The house itself did not know she counted. The oak floors did not know. The long, faded pier glass at the top of the stairs did not know. The portrait of her mother, painted the year before she died, did not know, though Louisa often looked up at it and thought that if her mother knew, her mother would have understood. There is a particular kind of woman that a house forgets. She is not the beautiful one. She is not the loud one. She is not the daughter who is spoken of at breakfast or the daughter who is remembered when a letter arrives from a cousin in London. She is the one who moves through the rooms as though she has been given the task of holding them together by hand, and who understands, without being told, that if she stops, the rooms will fall. Louisa was that daughter. She had been that daughter since she was 12, when her mother's illness had taken the household's mistress and left her father a widower who did not remarry. She had been that daughter more fully since she was 16, when her father's investments in the West India trade had begun to fail. She had been entirely that daughter since she was 19, when her elder sister Charlotte had come out into society and turned every eye in 3 parishes toward the yellow silk of her hair, and no eye at all toward the plainer sister behind her. Charlotte was 3 years older. Charlotte laughed at the top of her voice. Charlotte was fond of ribbons in her hair and of being told that she was fond of ribbons in her hair, and she was the sort of girl for whom mirrors were made. Louisa, next to her, was a mirror's rest. That autumn morning, Louisa was standing in her father's study by the last of the fire, adding a column, when her father came in without knocking. He was pale from a bad night, and he was holding a letter, and his hand shook a little when he set it on the desk. "He is coming, Louisa," said Sir Edmund. "On Thursday." She lifted her eyes from the ledger. "Who is coming, Papa?" "The gentleman I wrote to you about." He would not look at her. "The one from Somersetshire. Grey. Mr. Grey. He will stay a fortnight, and he will look you over, and if he is pleased, there will be an arrangement. And if there is an arrangement, Louisa, this house will stand. Do you understand me?" She was very quiet. She closed the ledger. She set her quill down. She said, "I understand, Papa." And she did understand. She had understood since the day the London solicitor's letter had arrived in July, and she had understood again in August when the second cook was let go, and she had understood a third time when the roofslater had come and left without being paid. She understood in the way that women in her position had always understood, that a house is a debt to which someone must be married, and that in her family that someone was going to be her because Charlotte was too beautiful to be traded and Louisa was not. "He will bring only a small carriage," her father was saying. "He does not stand on ceremony. He wrote so himself. Only a small carriage and himself and a valet." He hesitated. "You will wear the blue silk for dinner. And you will smile, Louisa, if you can manage it." She said nothing. She was not thinking of the blue silk. She was thinking of a stray dog that had come to the kitchen door 2 mornings running, and to whom she had given the last of the bread, and she was thinking that if she was to be married for the roof, she would like at least to meet the man in the dress she wore when she counted candles at midnight, so that he might see, once, what he was buying. She would meet Mr. Grey. She would meet him in her plainest grey wool gown, the one she wore to the kitchens and to the ledgers and to the stables in the morning, and she would let him decide what he thought of her before her father dressed her up in blue. That was her only piece of defiance, and she carried it up the stairs to her room like a small hot coal. Autumn, meanwhile, went on collecting its debts. The elms had one leaf apiece by the following Tuesday. And on the Thursday morning, at a little past 10, a plain black carriage with no crest on the door turned in at the Harrowden gates. She saw him from the landing window. He stepped down from the carriage without waiting for the step to be set, and he handed his own small case to the coachman rather than to the footman who ran out from the hall door, and he stood a moment in the yard looking up at the west front of the house with the sort of expression a man makes when he has been traveling all night and has arrived at a place he has been thinking about. He was not tall in the way Charlotte's admirers were tall. He was tall in the way an oak is tall, quiet, upright, and older than he looked. He wore a plain dark traveling coat. No cape, no jewelry. His hair was dark and cropped shorter than the fashion. His face was not handsome by drawing-room standards. It was better than that. It was the face of a man who paid attention. Louisa turned from the window and went down the back stairs in her gray wool. She met him for the first time in the yellow parlor at 11 o'clock, and it went exactly as she had expected it to go and exactly as she had not. Sir Edmund had done his best. He had put on his best coat, and he had put Charlotte in the pale pink morning dress with the ribbons at the sleeves, and he had put a fresh log on the fire, and he had had the last of the good tea brought out in the good service, and he had arranged the room so that a stranger walking in would see, first, the sunlit chair by the window and then Charlotte in it, and then, if he looked further, the second daughter standing near the sideboard in her plain gray wool. The stranger did not look at Charlotte. He looked at Louisa. He bowed. He did not bow deeply. He bowed with the exact degree of respect one gentleman offers another gentleman's daughter, and no more and no less. He said, "Miss Whitcombe." He said, "Sir Edmund, it is very good of you to receive me." His voice was low. It was quieter than the room expected it to be. Sir Edmund had prepared himself for a man of business, and Charlotte had prepared herself for a suitor, and Louisa had prepared herself for a purchaser, and none of them had prepared themselves for a man who spoke as though he had known the room for a long time and had come back to it after a journey. He gave his name as Mr. Gray, Nathaniel Gray, from Somersetshire. He offered no further particulars. He said that his estate was small and that he had business in the county for a fortnight, and that Sir Edmund's letter of introduction had been very kind, and that if it was convenient, he would be glad to walk the grounds after tea and take his supper with the family in the evening. He did not sit. He stood at the window with his hands folded behind his back as though he was waiting for something to be decided. Sir Edmund said that everything was very convenient indeed. Sir Edmund said that they were honored to have him. Sir Edmund said, with a little laugh that Louisa knew was his frightened laugh, that his younger daughter had been very much looking forward to the visit. Mr. Gray turned his head then. He looked at Louisa. He looked at her plainly, without the flick of the eye that other men gave her, the flick that swept past her to Charlotte and back again. He said, "Miss Louisa Whitcombe." He said it as though he was reading a name from a page that already belonged to him. He said, "You did not wear the blue silk." Louisa felt the room stop. Charlotte was staring. Sir Edmund was staring. The house itself, Louisa thought, was staring. She said very quietly, before she could stop herself, "No, sir, I did not." He waited. He did not press her. He did not smile. He waited as a man waits at the door of a house he intends to buy, to see whether the master will let him in on the terms the master has already stated in the letter, or whether the master will now, seeing him plainly, wish to change the terms. Louisa lifted her chin a fraction. She said, "If you are here to look me over, Mr. Gray, I thought it fair that you look me over as I am, and not as my father would dress me. If you dislike what you see, we shall save one another the fortnight." She heard her own voice and did not know it, and was surprised to find that her hands were steady. There was a very long silence. Then Mr. Gray did the thing that Louisa would remember, afterwards, as the first ledger line in the account of him. An account she would keep, in her head, in Candlelit time, for a great many months to come. He inclined his head. He said, "Miss Whitcombe, I am obliged to you." He said it as though she had done him a favor. He said, "I shall write my terms this afternoon if you will hear them, and you will, if you please, write yours." He turned to Sir Edmund. He said, "With your permission, sir." And Sir Edmund, who had opened his mouth to speak 3 times and found nothing to say, closed his mouth and nodded. That was how Louisa Whitcombe met her Mr. Gray. She did not know that as he walked out of the yellow parlor and up the stairs to the room the housekeeper had prepared for him, he stopped once at the landing window that looked down over the drive, and he lifted his hand to his mouth, and he did not know whether he was laughing or whether he was moved, but he stood at the window a full minute before he went on. He did not know whether she would sign the terms he was writing. He was, he thought, willing to lose the fortnight to find out. From his perspective, 200 miles away and 3 months earlier, Nathaniel Grey Ashmere, the 4th Duke of Ashmere, had sat in the library at Ashmere Court with a letter on his knee and a fire burning low. His grandmother, the Dowager Countess Avellini, had written to him from Bath. She had said, "There is a girl in Somersetshire. Her father is Sir Edmund Whitcombe. He is drowning quietly. She has been counting his ledgers since she was 15. I have this from my old friend, the vicar's wife at Nether Harrowden, who has been Louisa Whitcombe's godmother since her christening and who is not given to sentiment. She is not beautiful. She is exactly what you are looking for, and if you have any sense you will not tell her who you are until she has decided what she thinks of you." Nathaniel had read the letter 3 times. He was 31, and he had been the Duke of Ashmere for 4 years, and in those 4 years he had been introduced to every well-connected unmarried gentlewoman between Bath and Berwick, and he had liked none of them, and none of them had liked him. Not him, precisely, but the coronet and the 10,000 a year, and the 4 estates and the London house on Grosvenor Square. He had come to understand that if he was to be married to a wife rather than to a valuation, he would have to go and find one somewhere the valuation did not go first. He had written back to his grandmother. He had said, "I shall go as Grey. I shall write to Sir Edmund as a Mr. Grey from Somersetshire, a modest gentleman with a small estate and an interest in an arrangement. I shall let him look me over as a country buyer looks over a bad harvest. I shall let his daughter look me over as she pleases. If she signs my terms, I shall marry her. And if she signs them without knowing, I shall tell her, in my own time, in my own place, the whole truth. On my honor." The Dowager Countess had written back 1 sentence. She had written, "See that you do." Now, sitting in the room the housekeeper had prepared for him at Harrowden Hall, Nathaniel Grey Ashmere, Mr. Grey for the fortnight and for such longer as the girl in the grey wool required, took his writing case from his valet, and he set the candle at his elbow, and he wrote out his terms. He wrote them in his own hand. He wrote clearly. He wrote that the marriage should take place at the parish church of Nether Harrowden within 1 month of her acceptance. That Sir Edmund's debts to the amount of £9,000 should be paid in full by Mr. Grey on the morning of the wedding. That Harrowden Hall should remain in Sir Edmund's name for his lifetime, and be repaired at Mr. Grey's cost. That Miss Louisa Whitcombe should have a personal settlement of £2,000 a year, in her own name, from the day of the wedding, and that this settlement should be irrevocable and not contingent upon her conduct, her fertility, or the continuance of the marriage. That she should keep her own correspondence unread by him. That she should have the use of the library at his estate without permission. And that she should be free at any time within the 1st year to refuse the marriage in fact, if not in name, and to live separately at his cost. He read it over. He signed it Nathaniel Grey. He folded it, and he did not seal it because a sealed letter would want a seal, and the seal he owned bore a ducal crest. He rang the bell, and he sent it down to Miss Whitcombe with the housekeeper, and he asked, through the housekeeper, whether she would be so good as to write her own terms in reply. Louisa read his terms in her bedroom by the window, at the desk her mother had used. She read them once quickly. She read them a second time slowly. She read them a third time with her hand pressed flat against the page, as though she were feeling for a false floor. She could not find one. The 2,000 a year in her own name was not a courtesy. It was a shield. The clause allowing her to refuse the marriage in fact was not a favor. It was a door left unlocked. The clause about her correspondence was— she could not think what the clause about her correspondence was, except that it was the gesture of a man who assumed she would have correspondence, and who did not intend to read it. She took her own paper. She dipped her pen. She wrote her terms in her own hand, clearly, without preamble. That she should have charge of the household books at his estate, and full authority over the household staff, subject only to his correction if she erred. That the small round tea table in the yellow parlor at Harrowden, her mother's table, should travel with her to his house, and stand somewhere he would agree to, that the stray dog at the kitchen gate, whom she called Bramble, should travel with her also, that she should visit her father 4 times in the first year, that her sister Charlotte should be provided with a London season at Mr. Grey's cost, at Mr. Grey's timing, but with Louisa's consent as to the family with whom she was housed, and that if he was, in fact, not Mr. Grey, if his letter of introduction had understated him, if his name concealed some other name, if his estate was larger than he had said, she required only that he tell her before the vows were spoken, and not after. She signed it Louisa Whitcombe. She did not know why she had written the last clause. She had written it as one writes a thing one is not quite sure one means. She had written it because a plain black carriage without a crest is not, in a girl who has counted ledgers since she was 15, entirely without a footnote. She had written it and she had let it stand. She rang for the housekeeper. She sent her paper back up. From his perspective, sitting by his fire, Nathaniel Grey Ashmere read her terms once, and then a second time, and he laughed once, softly, in the empty room. He read the last clause a third time and stopped laughing. He sat with it a long while. Then he folded the paper very carefully, and he laid it inside his writing case, and he did not answer at once. He would tell her. He had always meant to tell her. He had not, until that moment, known when. The banns were read on 3 successive Sundays at the parish church of Nether Harrowden, and on the 4th Sunday, at 11 o'clock in the morning, Louisa Whitcombe was married to Nathaniel Grey. There were no flowers. The church was cold. Sir Edmund gave her away with a hand that would not steady. Charlotte stood in the second pew in the pink morning dress and did not cry, which surprised nobody, and did not smile, which surprised Louisa. The vicar, who had christened her, and who had been briefed by the Dowager Countess Avellini through her old friend the vicar's wife, kept his composure with the professional discipline of a man who has been asked to keep his composure by a woman he has been afraid of since 1789. Louisa wore the grey wool. She had chosen it herself. Sir Edmund had asked, once, whether she would not put on her mother's ivory silk, and she had said no, quietly, and he had not asked again. She wore her mother's small pearl cross at her throat, and no other ornament. Mr. Grey wore a plain dark coat and a plain white cravat. He answered his part of the vows in a voice that carried without effort. He put a plain gold ring on her finger, without a stone. He signed the register as Nathaniel Grey. He did not tell her before the vows. He had thought about it for 3 days, and he had come to it every hour of the 4th, and on the morning of the wedding he had stood at the window of his room at Harrowden and had watched the mist come off the elms, and he had understood, then, why he had not told her. He had understood that if he told her before the vows she would sign, because her father would drown otherwise, and she would not let her father drown, and she would never know afterwards whether she had signed of her own will or of duty. He had understood that if he told her after the vows, she would have the year he had given her by contract to decide what to do with him, and she would decide it without her father's roof in the balance, because her father's roof was already paid for. He would tell her at Ashmere Court, in the library, in her own time. He had, on his honor, meant it. The wedding breakfast was small. There was a ham. There was a cake that Mrs. Bassett, the housekeeper he had not yet introduced as his housekeeper, had sent down from Ashmere Court by post. Charlotte drank a glass of wine and made a small, dry speech about her sister that Louisa listened to without a change of expression. Sir Edmund made no speech, because he could not have managed one, and everybody at the table pretended to be glad of this. At 3 o'clock the plain black carriage was brought round. Louisa said goodbye to her father in the yellow parlor. She said, "Papa, the roof will hold." He kissed her forehead. He could not speak. She looked once at the small round tea table where her mother had taken her tea, and she said quietly, "It travels with me on Tuesday. Mr. Pulley knows." Her father nodded. She said goodbye to Charlotte at the carriage door. Charlotte said, "You have done a good thing for the family, Louisa." Louisa said, "I hope so." They did not embrace. Bramble, the stray dog, was already in the carriage on a folded blanket, looking mildly surprised to have been placed in a carriage. Mr. Grey handed her in himself. He said nothing on the road. He watched her once from his side of the seat when he thought she was not looking, and she was looking, and he did not look away when he saw that she was, and she did not look away either. She thought then that she had married a man who did not lie easily, and she wondered why the thought came to her at that moment, when he had, in fact, been lying to her since Thursday of the fortnight before. Ashmere Court came into view 3 miles before Louisa understood what it was. She saw first the wall, a long, low stone wall that followed the road for a mile without a break. She saw then the gate, an iron gate between 2 stone lodges, both of which were occupied, both of which had smoke rising from their chimneys, and at both of which the gatekeepers rose and stood as the carriage passed, and were bowed to by her husband from the carriage window with a small nod that was the nod of a man to men he saw every day of his life. She saw then the avenue, an avenue of limes a full half-mile long, straight, dressed for autumn, walked at that hour by no one, and at the end of it, at the top of a slow rise, she saw the house. It was not a small estate. It was the sort of house that historians write about. It stood in golden stone against a bank of copper beeches. It had a long central block and 2 wings, and a portico with 6 columns, and a fountain in the forecourt into which no fountain had any business being, at that hour, in that season, in Somersetshire, playing. Louisa did not speak. Her husband did not speak either. The carriage came to the door. The door opened before the coachman was down from his seat. A butler in a plain dark coat stepped out onto the step. Behind him a housekeeper, Mrs. Bassett, whom Louisa had not yet met but would soon have to greet, stepped out, and behind her, in 2 neat lines, 12 indoor servants stood on the gravel and bowed as the carriage stopped. The butler said, "Your Grace." Louisa heard the word. She sat very still. She did not turn her head. She did not look at her husband. She looked, instead, at the fountain, and at the copper beeches beyond it, and at the small, absurd fact that a stray dog she had picked up at a kitchen gate in Somersetshire was, at that precise moment, asleep on her lap in a carriage that had just been addressed as a ducal carriage by a butler in a coat that cost more than her father's best coat. Her husband said softly, "Louisa." She said, in the same tone in which she had spoken in the yellow parlor that first morning, without lifting her voice, "You should have told me before the vows, Mr. Gray." He said, "I meant to." She said, "Yes, I believe you meant to. That is not the same thing." He was quiet. She said, "Hand me down, if you please." He handed her down. She stepped onto the gravel. She stood in her grey wool traveling dress, with a stray dog in her arms, in front of the butler of Ashmere Court and the housekeeper of Ashmere Court and 12 indoor servants of Ashmere Court, and she was, in that moment, the Duchess of Ashmere. She did not know it yet in her body. She knew it only in the sudden, cold understanding that the plain black carriage, the plain traveling coat, the plain gold ring without a stone, the plain terms in his own hand, had all been a plain frame around a very much larger picture. She did not weep. She did not raise her voice. She did not, at any point in the first week, ask him a single further question. She thanked Mrs. Bassett for the reception. She curtsied once, briefly, and let Mrs. Bassett curtsy to her, and she went up to the room that had been prepared for her. A room the size of the yellow parlor at Harrowden, and she did not go down to dinner that night, and she asked, through Mrs. Bassett, for a tray, and she ate half of it, and she wrote a letter to her father, and she sealed it with a plain wafer, and she did not sign herself Louisa Ashmere. She signed herself Louisa. She and her husband ate at opposite ends of a long formal dining table for 6 mornings and 6 evenings. The table was 18 feet long. There was a butler between them and 2 footmen behind them, and she could not have heard him speak from her end of the table if he had spoken, and he did not. On the 7th morning he sent word, through Mrs. Bassett, that he had business at the London townhouse. He would return at the end of the fortnight. He hoped she would treat the house as her own. He had, he said, written to her father with the assurance she required. She read the note. She folded it. She said to Mrs. Bassett, "Thank you." And Mrs. Bassett, who had been the housekeeper at Ashmere Court since the year Nathaniel Gray Ashmere was 7 years old, and who had once had to explain to him why he could not marry the head groom's daughter, looked at the new Duchess in her grey wool and understood, with the housekeeper's precise instinct, that the Duke was giving his wife a house and a fortnight in which to decide what to do with him. Mrs. Bassett bowed. Mrs. Bassett said, "Yes, Your Grace." And Mrs. Bassett went downstairs and told the second footman, quietly, that the household was to be treated as though the Duchess had lived in it for 20 years, and that if any servant so much as blinked at her grey wool, that servant would find themselves in the scullery by Friday. Louisa did not know this. She would not know this for 2 months. She only knew that her husband had gone, and that the house was hers to walk in, and that Bramble, the stray dog, was, for the first time in his mortal existence, sleeping on a silk cushion in a sunlit window. She stood a long moment at that window. She watched Bramble sleep. She thought, he told me the truth about his terms. He did not tell me the truth about his name. She did not know, yet, which of those two things she would come to weigh more heavily, and she did not know which of them her husband, riding at that hour toward London through a cold October rain, was weighing on his own conscience in the carriage. He was weighing them both. He was weighing them badly. He knew, riding, that he had given her every clause a wife could ask for and had not given her the one thing that mattered, which was the truth of who she had married before she had signed. He knew he had spared her a decision made under her father's pressure by making her a decision she now had to make under his own house's weight. He did not know whether that was worse. He would ride to London, and he would leave her alone at Ashmere Court, and he would come back at the end of the fortnight, and if she would not sit down to dinner with him at the long table then, he would eat, if she would let him, at a smaller one. The first evening at the long table was, in Louisa's private accounting, the coldest meal she had ever eaten in her life, and she had eaten some cold meals. Mrs. Bassett had gone to the trouble of a 5-course dinner, and every course had been correctly cooked and correctly served, and the wine had been correctly poured, and the butler, whose name was Mr. Chessington, had stood behind Louisa's chair for 2 hours without once shifting his weight, and Louisa had, at the end of it, been unable to say what she had eaten. She had watched, instead, the candles between herself and her husband. There were 7 candles in the branched silver candelabrum at the middle of the table, and the middle candle had, at some point between the soup and the fish, guttered slightly, and Louisa had watched it recover and had thought that it was, perhaps, an image of her marriage. A light but not steady and not, at present, the responsibility of anyone at the table to look after. On the second evening she had not gone down. On the third she had gone down and asked, quietly, if she might have the small dining room prepared instead. Mrs. Bassett had said, "Of course, Your Grace," and Mr. Chessington had said nothing at all, and the small dining room had been prepared by dinner, and Louisa had eaten in it alone, and the long formal dining room had, from that evening on, been closed. She had not, at that point, met the head steward, and she had not, at that point, met the head groom, and she had not, at that point, understood what it would mean for the household when the mistress of Ashmere Court asked, on her third night, for the long formal dining room to be closed. She learned, over the next week, that the household had heard her request, and that the household had, in its several parts, made a private decision about her that Mrs. Bassett would only tell her about at Christmas, and that decision was, in the language of the housekeeper's room, that the new Duchess was not a mistress who required a stage. Louisa did not spend her fortnight brooding. She spent it walking the house. She began on the morning of the second day, at 7 o'clock in the grey wool, with Mrs. Bassett at her elbow, and she walked Ashmere Court from the coal cellar to the muniment room in the attics, and she asked, at every doorway, the same 3 questions in the same quiet voice. The first was, "What is the purpose of this room?" The second was, "Who keeps it and how often is it kept?" The third was, "Is there anything in it or about it that is not right?" Mrs. Bassett had been asked, in the course of her 41 years in service, a great many questions by a great many ladies of a great many houses, and she had never been asked those 3. She had been asked whether the drapes in the yellow bedroom were of the current fashion, and she had been asked whether the head cook could be induced to make a soufflé, and she had been asked whether the dowager's rose garden might be replanted in lavender. She had never been asked what a room was for, and who kept it, and whether anything about it was wrong. By the end of the second day Mrs. Bassett had written, on the small slate she kept in her office pocket, for notes, and each of them was in Louisa's handwriting, dictated aloud, and each of them was a small, exact correction to the running of a room. The linen in the third-floor guest suite was to be aired every second week, not every fourth. The bread in the servants' hall was to be from the same day's baking as the bread in the dining room. There was, Louisa said, no defensible reason for a difference. The second housemaid, who had been favoring her right hand for a week, was to be given 3 days of half work, and Mrs. Bassett was to send for the apothecary. The hearth in the small library, a hearth Louisa had passed once and paused at, because she had felt cold air coming down the chimney at an angle that no hearth should, was to be examined by the mason, at the estate's cost, before the week was out. None of these instructions were given in a raised voice. None of them were given as if they were instructions at all. They were given as observations, in the voice of a woman who had counted her father's ledgers for 7 years and had learned that a household reveals its state to anyone who is willing to look at it plainly. Mrs. Bassett, by the end of the 3rd day, was in love with the new Duchess in a manner she would not have admitted to under a bright light. Mrs. Bassett was 61 years old, and she had grown up in a house where the mistress had never once come below stairs, and she had accepted this as the natural order of things, and she was now watching a mistress in a grey wool traveling dress come, at 6:30 in the morning, into her own housekeeper's room, and sit at her own housekeeper's table and ask, quietly, for tea and drink it, and read the household books until the 7 o'clock bell. Louisa read the household books cover to cover in 3 days. She did not read them for suspicion. She read them for shape. She wanted to understand what Ashmere Court was in its running before she understood what it was in its rooms. On the 4th morning she wrote a letter to the head steward, whom she had not yet met, and who was at the London house with the Duke. She wrote to him plainly. She said, "I am new to this house, and I do not intend to be a foolish mistress. I have read the household books for the last 5 years, and I have observations. I do not require them acted upon in your absence. I require them acknowledged when you return." She listed her observations. There were 11. She signed the letter Louisa Ashmere. It was the first time she had signed the name. She looked at it a moment on the page. She said, aloud to Bramble, who was asleep under the desk, "That is who I am now." Bramble did not comment. She sealed the letter with a plain wafer, because she had not yet been given a seal. On the 5th morning she began to visit the tenants. She did not tell Mrs. Bassett. She simply put on her grey wool cloak, and her plainest bonnet, and her walking boots, and she took Bramble on a length of twine, and she went out at the kitchen door and she walked. She walked to the nearest cottage, 1/2 a mile down the avenue, and she knocked on the door, and she said to the woman who opened it, "My name is Louisa. I am the new Duchess. I do not know your name yet, and I have come to introduce myself." The woman who opened the door, Mrs. Halley, wife of the undergardener, mother of 4, stood in her doorway a full 10 seconds without answering, and then she began to laugh, and then she began to cry, and then she said, "Come in, ma'am, and mind the step, and I have no cake, but I have bread, and if your grace does not mind sitting at a kitchen table I will be very glad." Louisa sat at Mrs. Halley's kitchen table. She stayed 40 minutes. She learned the names of Mrs. Halley's 4 children. She learned that the roof over Mrs. Halley's kitchen had a leak that had been reported to the understeward and had not been mended for 11 months. She wrote it down in the small book she carried in her cloak pocket, on the 11th line of a fresh page. She did not promise it would be mended. She said, "I have written it down. I do not know yet what I can do." She visited 4 cottages that morning. She visited 7 the next. She visited 14 by the end of the fortnight. She had, by the time her husband returned from London, a small book with 68 lines in it, and beside each line, in her tidy hand, the name of a tenant, the name of a room or a field or a fence, and one small specific problem. She had learned 2 things in the fortnight, and she had not spoken either of them aloud. The first was that the Duke of Ashmere had been, before her arrival, a decent master to his tenants, and that his tenants respected him without loving him, and that no one on the estate had a bad word for him beyond the observation that he was reserved and did not visit them often. The second was that she was herself being watched, not by any single person, by the house, by the estate, by Mrs. Bassett, who set down the tea a second earlier when Louisa sat than she did when any other person sat, by the second footman, who had begun, on the 5th day, to bow more deeply to her than he did to the visiting curate, by the head groom who had come on the 7th morning to the kitchen door in his own clean coat to be introduced to her, and who had said, in a voice she had not expected, "Your Grace, if you will forgive my saying so, the master will be very glad to know you have come out to the stables. He has not, if I may say, brought a lady here before." Louisa had said, quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Loder, Your Grace. Head groom this 18 year. Thank you, Mr. Loder." She had thought, walking back to the house, that she was being watched not as a stranger, but as a mistress. She had thought that the household had decided, without consulting her, that she was to be loved. She had thought that this was, on balance, a very difficult thing to be, when one had been married for a fortnight to a man who had told one a lie of omission on the morning of one's wedding. She had thought, in the small book in her cloak pocket, of adding a 69th line. She had not added it. She had let it stand, unwritten, in her head, where it was quieter. There was, in the mornings of that fortnight, a particular rhythm Louisa came to keep. She rose before 6. She dressed by candlelight, without waking her maid, in the grey wool. She went first to the kitchen door, where Bramble waited to be let out into the yard, and where she left, every morning, a slice of yesterday's bread on the low stone by the kitchen step for the second stray. A thin, cautious tabby cat who had begun coming to the yard on the 4th morning and who did not, yet, come near enough to be seen properly. Louisa had not told the kitchen about the cat. She had not told the kitchen about the bread. She had understood, from her years at Harrowden, that a small kindness carried out quietly, without being seen, is a different order of kindness from one carried out to be praised. After the bread, she went to the housekeeper's room for tea. Mrs. Bassett was, by 6, always awake and always at her desk, and she had, by the 4th morning of the fortnight, come to expect the Duchess at 10 minutes past 6, and had come to have the tea ready. They did not, at first, speak. Louisa read the household book. Mrs. Bassett wrote in her own small ledger. Bramble slept under the desk. And in the quiet of the housekeeper's room, at 6 in the morning, in a house that would not properly wake for another hour, Louisa learned more about the running of a great English estate than she had learned in 7 years of running a small one, because Mrs. Bassett had, in those 41 years of service, learned every mistake it was possible to make in the running of a great English estate, and had, over the fortnight, quietly and without being asked, begun to tell Louisa about each one. By the 7th morning Mrs. Bassett was, by unspoken agreement, sitting at the same table with the Duchess of Ashmere at 10 past 6 drinking tea from the same pot, and neither of them was, in Louisa's private accounting, prepared to say aloud that this had become a rhythm they intended to keep. The Duke of Ashmere returned from London on a Tuesday evening in a fine cold rain, and he came into his own house through the side door, and he asked, in the hall, for Mrs. Bassett, and Mrs. Bassett said, without smiling, "Her Grace is in the small library, Your Grace. She has been there since 4. He said, "Thank you, Mrs. Bassett." He did not go up to change. He went down the corridor in his damp traveling coat, and he stopped at the small library door, and he stood there a moment with his hand not quite on the handle, and he heard her inside, turning a page. He had not, in the fortnight, sent her a letter. She had not, in the fortnight, sent him one. He had been at Ashmere House on Grosvenor Square attending to a piece of parliamentary business he could not defer, and he had thought about her 100 times a day, and he had not written because he had not known what to write, and because he had, at last, decided that if she was to have her fortnight in his house alone, she was to have it clean. He opened the door. She was sitting in the wing chair by the fire in her grey wool. There was a book on her lap, and a small book open on the table beside her, a household book. Bramble was on the hearthrug at her feet. She looked up when he came in. She did not stand. He said, "Louisa." She said, "Your Grace." He closed the door behind him. He said, "Please, not that." He said, "Louisa, please." She said, "Then sit down, sir, and let us begin." He sat down. He sat opposite her in the second wing chair, in his damp traveling coat, and he laid his hat on the small round tea table that stood between them, and he did not, at first, notice the table. He was too much occupied with the woman opposite. Then he noticed the table. He looked at it. He said, "This is not the table that stood here." She said, "No. It is my mother's. Came on Tuesday from Harrowden. I have put it here. There was a large formal table here before, and I have had it removed to the store. If you wish it back, I shall have it brought." He looked at the table. He looked at her. He said, "I do not wish it back." She said, "Very well." They sat quiet a moment. The fire moved. He said, "You have visited the tenants." She said, "Yes." He said, 68 cottages." She said, 68. He said, "Loder told me. Also Mrs. Halley. Also the vicar at Sarnford, who wrote to me at Grosvenor Square." He paused. He said, quietly, "Also Mrs. Bassett, who sent me a private note by the second post to say that I would find, on my return, that my house had a mistress." She said it in those exact words. Louisa said nothing. He said, "I have brought you your seal." He took it from his coat pocket. It was a small silver seal on a short chain. He set it on the round table between them. She looked at it. She did not take it up. She said, "It has your crest." He said, "It has our crest." She said, "That is not a distinction I have yet agreed to make." He said, "I know." He waited. She looked at the fire. She said, without turning her head, "You have paid my father's debts. Mrs. Bassett showed me the paper on the third morning. She was not sure whether she was to, and she showed me, and I read it. £9,241. You did not tell me it was above 9,000. He said it was above 9,000. I did not think the £241 worth the mention. She said, it was worth the mention to my father. He said, yes, fairly said. She said, you have paid for the roof at Harrowden. Mr. Pulley wrote to me. He said, yes. She said, you have paid for a season for Charlotte in London, at the house of your cousin Lady Marchmont, whose daughter, Cordelia, I understand, is coming out this autumn also. He said, yes. His voice altered slightly on the second yes. She noticed the alteration and did not remark upon it. She stored it in her book. She said, you have done every clause you wrote in your own hand at Harrowden. You have done more than every clause. He said, I promised I would. She said, you did not promise, however, to be Mr. Gray. You promised, in a clause I did not write into the terms because I did not know I needed to write it, that you would tell me your true name before the vows. You did not tell me. He was still. He said, I did not. He said, I have thought of nothing else for a fortnight. I did not, because I believed that if I told you before the vows, you would sign to save your father, and you would never know afterwards whether you had signed for him or for yourself. I meant to tell you here in this house in your own time, and I intended it. I did not intend to be found out by my own butler on the gravel. He paused. He said, that is a poor apology because you did not ask for the choice to be made for you. You asked for the truth before the vows. I made a decision for you that I had no right to make. I am sorry. I do not ask you to forgive me. I ask you to let me set the record straight now, and let you decide what you wish to do with it. She looked at him. She said quietly, set it straight. Then, he said, my name is Nathaniel Gray Ashmere. Gray was my mother's name. It is on my baptismal certificate. It is not a false name. It is a name I have never had cause to use in public. I am the 4th Duke of Ashmere. I am 31 years old. I have 4 estates and a house on Grosvenor Square. I have 10,000 a year clear of debt. I have no living parents. My grandmother is the Dowager Countess Avellini, who lives at Bath, who wrote to me of you in July, and who, I will tell you plainly, is the reason I came to Harrowden. I came to find a wife who would not know what I was worth when she looked at me. I found one. I married her. I have concealed my name from her for 1 fortnight after the vows in the belief that she deserved a house without her father's roof leaning on it before she looked at the man in it. I have been wrong about that. I see it now. That is the whole of it. She sat a long while. She said, the Dowager Countess Avellini. He said, my grandmother. Yes. She said, I should like to meet her. He said, she has already written to say she is coming. She almost smiled. She did not. She said, of course she has. She looked at the small round table between them. She said, I have made changes in the house. Not many. I shall list them. If you dislike any, you may say so, and I shall reverse them. But I shall not reverse the table. He said, not the table. She said, Nathaniel. She had never said his name. She said, I am not ready to sit at the long table with you. I do not know when I shall be. I do not know whether I will forgive the fortnight, or the vows, or the fact that I discovered my own name from a butler on the gravel. I know that you have done what you said you would do, and more, and that you did the wrong thing in the right spirit, and that I do not yet know what to do with a man who does that. I know, however, that this small round table is here, and that I can sit at it, and that you can sit at it, and that if you wish at breakfast tomorrow we may take our breakfast here at this table together. If you would prefer to eat at the long one, you may. He said quietly, I should like to take my breakfast here. She said, very well. They sat. The fire moved. Bramble sighed in his sleep. Somewhere in the house a clock struck the half-hour. we'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Their breakfasts, over the weeks that followed, developed a shape of their own. Mrs. Bassett brought the tray in at 7:30. Coffee for the Duke, tea for the Duchess, 2 boiled eggs, a small dish of butter, a plate of the same day's bread, and she set it on the small round table between them, and she withdrew and she closed the door behind her, and she did not, in 6 weeks, forget once to close the door behind her. They read in silence at first. The letters that came by the early post were sorted by Mr. Chessington in the hall and brought up on a silver tray. Nathaniel took his half, and Louisa, at his quiet suggestion at the end of the first week, took hers. She had never, before her marriage, received a letter that anyone else in the house had touched with respect. She had, before her marriage, received her father's overdue notices, redirected in her hand from her father's dressing room, and she had received Charlotte's occasional notes on ribbons. She had not received a letter as a woman whose letters were her own business. She received one now every morning, and she read it at the small round table across from her husband, and he did not, at any point in that fortnight, or in the ones that followed, or in the ones that followed after them, ask her what any letter said. She had, on the 9th morning, told him what a letter said without being asked. A letter from Mr. Pulley at Harrowden about a fence, and he had said quietly, "Thank you, Louisa," and had not made a habit of expecting to be told. That, in her private accounting, was a further ledger line, on a page she had begun keeping for Nathaniel Gray Ashmere. She noted, on the 14th morning, that he took his coffee without sugar, and that he cut his bread crossways rather than lengthways, and that when he read a letter he did not particularly like, he set his cup down very quietly, as though he did not wish the cup to know his opinion. She noted these things without commenting on them. She noted them because she was becoming, in her own house, an observer of her own husband, and because she had discovered, in the process, that being an observer of her own husband was the closest thing to happiness she had had since her mother had died. The Dowager Countess Avellini arrived at Ashmere Court on a Thursday afternoon in a coach that was, by contrast to her grandson's, unashamedly her own. A dark green traveling coach with a small gilt monogram on the panel, an elderly coachman who had been her coachman for 32 years, and a lady's maid whose entire face was arranged in the expression of a woman who had made this same journey many times and did not intend to be surprised by any part of it. The Dowager was 78. She was small. She wore black and a modest lace cap under her bonnet, and she walked with a stick of polished cherry wood that had been her husband's, and she came up the steps of Ashmere Court at a pace that suggested she was not entirely certain her grandson was worth the last 4 of the steps. Louisa met her in the hall. Louisa had, for the occasion, dressed in a dark blue morning gown that Mrs. Bassett had made up for her that fortnight from a piece of merino Louisa had chosen herself. Long-sleeved, floor-length, plain at the throat and closed to the collarbone with a small dark button. She had left off the pearls. She wore no jewelry but the plain gold ring. The Dowager stopped 3 paces in front of her. She looked at Louisa for what would have been, in any drawing-room in Bath, an offensively long moment. She looked at the gown. She looked at the throat. She looked at the ring. She looked at the eyes. She said at last, in a voice that was smaller and sharper than Louisa had expected, "Child, come here." Louisa came. The Dowager put both her hands on Louisa's arms. She looked at her from very close. She said, "You are Louisa Whitcombe." She said, "You are the girl who counted her father's ledgers by candlelight since she was 15. She said, "You have visited 68 cottages in a fortnight, and you have moved a table in my grandson's library, and you have not, so far as I can determine, raised your voice once. Is that so?" Louisa said, "Yes, ma'am." The Dowager said, "Then you will call me Avellini when we are alone, and grandmother when the servants are near, and you will oblige me by not calling me anything else. I have been Avellini for 52 years, and I do not intend to be your grace by a person I intend to like." Louisa, in spite of herself, laughed a little. It was the first laugh she had made in the house. The Dowager heard it. She stored it. She said, over her shoulder, without turning her head, "Nathaniel, come here." The Duke came. The Dowager said, "I have 3 things to say to you. The first is that you should have told her before the vows. The second is that you had, at the time, reasons that were as good as reasons of that kind can be, and I am prepared to write you a letter tomorrow saying so, if she wishes ever to consult it." The third is that if you did not deserve her, on the day of your wedding, you may deserve her by Christmas if you attend to her closely. Do you understand me? The Duke said, I understand you, ma'am. The Dowager said, then go and speak to your steward. I have your wife for the afternoon. The Duke went. The Dowager took Louisa's arm. She said, show me the small library. I hear you have put your mother's table in it. Louisa took her to the small library. The Dowager sat in the wing chair by the fire. She said, now, tell me everything. And when you tell me plainly, because I am too old for the drawing-room version, and I liked your mother. She had a sensible face. Louisa told her. She told her about the letter to her father in July. She told her about the 7 years of ledgers. She told her about the grey wool. She told her about the terms in her own hand and about the last clause she had not known why she had written. She told her about the butler on the gravel and about the fortnight and about the 68 cottages and about the leak in Mrs. Halley's kitchen roof and about the small round table and about the fact that she had said her husband's Christian name once and could not yet bring herself to say it twice. The Dowager listened without interrupting. When Louisa had finished, the Dowager sat quite still a moment. Then she said, Louisa, listen to me. You will be told, this winter, and in the season that comes, and for the rest of your life, that you married my grandson for his rank. There will be, in London, women who will say it into your face, and there will be, in this county, women who will say it behind your back, and there will be, in your own bedroom, moments in which you will hear it said in your own head. You will require an answer to it. I shall give you one now, and you will keep it in the small book you carry in your cloak pocket, and you will look at it when you need it. Are you ready to hear it? Louisa said, yes, Avellini. The Dowager said, you did not marry him for his rank. You married him without knowing his rank. That is a distinction the world will not understand, and it does not matter that the world will not understand it, because you will know it, and he will know it, and I will know it, and by Christmas Mrs. Bassett will know it, and that will be enough. Louisa said, yes. The Dowager said, good. Now, there is a ball at Marchmont House on the 2nd of December. My cousin's daughter Cordelia is coming out. Your sister Charlotte is, I am told, to be presented from that house. You will attend. Cordelia Marchmont has been in love with my grandson since she was 17, without his encouragement and without his knowledge, and she will hate you on sight. I will be with you. You will wear a color I choose. And we will, at the end of the evening, walk you out of that ballroom as the Duchess of Ashmere and not as a curiosity. Do you understand me? Louisa said quietly, yes, Avellini. The Dowager patted her hand. She said, then we shall have tea. And after tea I shall tell you about your husband when he was 7 and wanted to marry the head groom's daughter. It is a very useful piece of information for a wife to have. The weeks between the Dowager's arrival and the ball at Marchmont House were the quietest and, in Louisa's later reckoning, the most important of her married life. She and Nathaniel took their breakfasts at the small round table in the small library. They took them at 7:30, before the household was fully astir. He read the letters that had come by the early post, and she read the household book, and they exchanged the newspaper between them, and they spoke at first only of practical matters, the roofs, the tenants, the accounts. On the 5th morning he told her, without looking up from his coffee, that the mason had come out to the small library hearth and had found a bird's nest, 3 inches wide, at the flue's turning, which had been diverting the cold air, and that she had been correct to notice it, and that she was, in his estimation, the most competent judge of a hearth he had ever known. She said, thank you. He said, that is not flattery. She said, I did not take it for flattery. He looked up, then. He said, Louisa. She said, Nathaniel. That was the day she began to say his name. They rode out together in the afternoons. He rode a tall gray mare called Chime. She rode a quieter chestnut cob named Susan, who had been chosen for her by the head groom, Mr. Loder, on the specific instruction of the Dowager, who had said, the Duchess is not vain about a horse. She will thank you for a mare that will not embarrass her. Mr. Loder had chosen Susan, and Louisa had thanked him, and Susan had, in fact, not embarrassed her. They rode out together at 3 and they came back at 5 in the short blue afternoons of November with the light going, and the hedgerows stripped, and the smoke rising straight from the cottages, and on one such afternoon, coming back down the avenue at the walk, Nathaniel said, without turning his head, There is a piece of land at the north of the estate, Weatherfield, where my father took down a hedgerow 40 years ago to enlarge a field. The tenants have never had a good crop from it. I have been thinking of replanting the hedgerow. I should be glad of your opinion. She said, I should like to see it. He said, tomorrow. She said, tomorrow. They saw Weatherfield the next afternoon. She walked the field with him. She said, you should replant the hedgerow. And you should put a small pond in the low corner where the water sits after rain, because your grandfather's steward's book from 1782 says there was one there, and Mr. Loder says the deer used to water there, and if you put the pond back you will not lose a root of ground you are currently cropping, because you are not currently cropping it. It stands in water 3 months of the year. She paused. She said, I read the 1782 steward's book last week. I asked Mrs. Bassett for it. He looked at her a long moment. He said, you read my grandfather's steward's book from 1782 last week. She said, yes. He said, Louisa. She said, it is a very good book. Your grandfather noticed things. He said, so do you. They walked back to the horses without speaking. She was aware, walking, that he was, at that moment, not the Duke of Ashmere. He was a man walking a field with a woman whose opinion he had asked, and had received, and had, in his silence, not merely accepted but rearranged himself around. She had never had a man rearrange himself around her opinion before. She did not know what to do with it. She stored it. Not in the small book. In herself. The dowager stayed a fortnight. On her last morning she said to Louisa, in the small library, quietly, you will be at the Marchmont ball in 3 weeks. I have written to Lady Marchmont. Your sister Charlotte is very well. She is out 5 nights a week and she is much admired. Cordelia is not troubled by her. She paused. Cordelia is troubled by you, and she has not yet seen you. I am telling you this because she will do something at the ball. She will attempt to do it publicly. She has, I understand from Lady Marchmont's second-best confidant, been trying for 2 months to obtain a copy of a certain letter that a certain foolish young man at Ashmere Court wrote to Nathaniel 3 years ago in a matter of a horse and a debt, and which, if she has it, she will attempt to use to make it appear that my grandson has behaved dishonorably in a matter of business. The dowager's mouth thinned. She will not succeed, because the letter, in fact, exonerates Nathaniel, and the foolish young man was Cordelia's own cousin, and the debt was paid by Nathaniel out of pocket to spare the young man's family the humiliation. But she does not know the letter exonerates him. She thinks she has him. Do you understand? Louisa said, I understand. The dowager said, good. Do not tell Nathaniel. If you tell him he will attempt to spare you, and you do not need sparing. Wear the color I have chosen. Wear no jewelry but the plain gold ring. Bring the letter I shall send by post from Bath on the 1st of December. Put it in your reticule. Do not produce it unless she produces hers. When she produces hers, produce yours. Do you understand me, Louisa? Louisa said, yes, Avellini. The dowager kissed her on the forehead. She said, then you are a duchess. Go and see that the household is packed for London. She left in her dark green coach that afternoon. Louisa did not tell Nathaniel. She packed for London. She took the small round table, disassembled, in a crate lined with straw. She took Bramble. She took the small book from her cloak pocket, and she added a 69th line to it, and the line was, Cordelia Marchmont, December 2nd, letter re Weatherfield Horsedebt, exonerates N. Produce only if she produces first. She looked at the line. She closed the book. She said quietly to Bramble, who was asleep on the packed trunk, we are going to London. She did not tell Nathaniel. She had been married to him for 11 weeks. She was going to a ball in a color the dowager had chosen. A soft, deep silver gray, 3 shades warmer than the wool she had worn to her wedding, in a fabric that caught the candlelight without glittering, with long sleeves and a modest square neckline closed at the collarbones with a plain ribbon. And she was going, whether or not Nathaniel Gray Ashmere knew it, to be at last, and in his sight and in his enemy's sight and in her sister's sight, seen. On the last afternoon before they left for London, Louisa stood alone in the small library at Ashmere Court with her hand on the small round table, and she thought, not sentimentally but plainly, that she was carrying, in her cloak pocket, a small book with 69 lines in it, and a letter from the Dowager Countess Avellini, and a plain gold ring on her finger without a stone, and that she was, in that moment, more armed than she had ever been in her life. She looked once more at the fire, and at the empty chair opposite hers, and she went, in her grey wool traveling cloak, out to the carriage in the yard, where Bramble was already waiting on the folded blanket, and where the small round table stood, disassembled and boxed, ready to travel with her to a house on Grosvenor Square she had not yet seen. The London season, that year, opened for Louisa in the small back drawing-room at Ashmere House, Grosvenor Square, at 10:30 on the morning of the 28th of November, with Charlotte in the pale pink morning dress on the sofa opposite her, drinking coffee and saying, "I am, Louisa, extremely sorry." Louisa said, "Charlotte." Charlotte said, "I am extremely sorry, and I have been sorry since October, and I have not been able to write it, and now I am here and I shall say it. I did not know what he had paid. I did not know what he had promised. I did not know he was the Duke of anything at all. Papa did not know either. Papa told me when he came out of the study on the day the roof was done. Louisa, I did not know." Louisa said, "I know you did not." Charlotte said, "You wore the grey wool." Louisa said, "Yes." Charlotte said, "I laughed at you all my life. I laughed at you at the ball at Salter's. I laughed at you the morning he arrived. Louisa, I want to say this to you before I go to Lady Marchmont's on Tuesday and see, with everyone else, what you are. I was a bad sister. I intend to be less bad. I do not ask you to forgive me all at once. I ask you to let me try." Louisa looked at her sister a long moment. She said, "Charlotte, come here." Charlotte came. Louisa put a hand on her sister's cheek. She said, "I forgave you at Weatherfield. Do not ask me how I know. I forgave you when I was walking a field with my husband, in November. You were not in the field, but you were forgiven in it. Do you understand me?" Charlotte did not understand her. Charlotte, being Charlotte, cried instead, which was, in Louisa's estimation, an adequate substitute. They went to the ball at Marchmont House on the evening of the 2nd of December. The Marchmont ballroom that night was full to its walls. There were 400 people in a room built for 350. The candles at the sconces along the walls were fresh and burned so hot the ladies nearest them had begun, by 10 o'clock, to move away. Cordelia Marchmont was at the top of the room in a gown of shot gold. A very fine gown, expertly cut, with a low square neckline and short sleeves and a great deal of gold work at the hem, and she was standing beside her mother, and she was, so far as could be observed from any part of the room, in the highest spirits of her life. Louisa entered on the Duke of Ashmere's arm. She wore the silver-grey silk, caught the candlelight without glittering. It closed at the collarbones with a plain ribbon. It swept to the floor. She wore no jewelry but the plain gold ring. She had let her hair be done, that evening, by the dowager's own lady's maid, who had come up from Bath for the purpose, and who had done it exactly the way Louisa's own hair fell, only more so. She looked, as she came into the room, like a woman who had not tried, and who did not need to. The room saw her. It saw her not because she was showy. It saw her because she was not. There is a particular silence a ballroom makes when a duchess enters whom it has not yet met. It is not the silence of surprise. It is the silence of adjustment. 400 people were adjusting. They adjusted for perhaps 6 seconds. Then the room began to move again, and the music began again, and the Duke of Ashmere bowed to his hostess, and the Duchess of Ashmere curtsied to Lady Marchmont, and Charlotte curtsied at Louisa's elbow, and Cordelia Marchmont, at the top of the room, in her gown of shot gold, kept her smile fixed and inclined her head at exactly the angle a hostess's daughter is required to incline her head at a new-made duchess, whose rank stands 3 degrees above her own. The evening progressed. Louisa danced twice, once with Nathaniel, once with the dowager's cousin, a general in his 60s whom Avellini had positioned in the room for exactly this purpose. She spoke, at supper, to Lady Marchmont, and to Lady Marchmont's second daughter who was 15 and shy, and to an elderly bishop, and to the dowager. She did not go near Cordelia. Cordelia did not come near her. At a little after midnight, in the interval between the 4th and 5th dance, Cordelia Marchmont crossed the room. She crossed the room at exactly the moment a small party at the top of the room had drawn away, leaving a clear line of sight from the doors to the window at the west end where Louisa was standing with the dowager and Nathaniel. Cordelia crossed the room with a folded paper in her hand. She came up to the group. She curtsied to the dowager. She curtsied to Nathaniel. She did not curtsy to Louisa. She said, in a voice pitched to the pillar and to the 50 nearest people, Your Grace, might I trouble you a moment? I have here a matter of business, a small matter. A letter from Mr. Fenton of Weatherfield, 3 years past, regarding a horse and a debt of 160 guineas. I understand from my cousin, from Fenton's cousin, that the debt was, in fact, settled by yourself out of pocket in a manner that reflects on the honor of both parties. I hoped that your Grace's new wife, she inclined her head fractionally toward Louisa without looking at her, might wish to see the letter before it becomes, as I hear it may, the subject of some private conversation. I have brought it here. I did not think it a subject for the drawing rooms. She held out the letter. There was around them a very complete silence. Nathaniel Grey Ashmere, the Duke of Ashmere, who had, until that moment, not known a letter had been circulating, and who had not known his cousin's daughter Cordelia had been in love with him without his encouragement for 4 years, and who had not known that this was a trap, went very still. He was about, Louisa saw, to speak. Louisa put her hand on his arm. She said quietly, One moment, Nathaniel. She turned to Cordelia Marchmont. She said, in a voice that carried without effort. She had learned to speak in that voice in a servants' hall in a house that was mostly asleep. Miss Marchmont, I thank you for your kindness in bringing the matter to me privately, in the presence of only 150 people. I have, in fact, been in possession of a copy of Mr. Fenton's letter since the 1st of December, when it was sent to me from Bath by the Dowager Countess Avellini. I have it here. She opened her reticule. She took out the letter the Dowager had sent by post, in a hand 2 generations old, and she held it up so that it was visible unopened to Lady Marchmont across the room, and to the Dowager beside her, and to a dozen witnesses. She said, I have not opened it. I have not needed to. I have known the whole matter from my husband's own account of it, given to me at Weatherfield in November, when we walked the field where Mr. Fenton's horse was kept. He told me then that he had paid the debt out of his own pocket, and that he had done so to spare Mr. Fenton's family a public embarrassment, and that he had never spoken of it since to any person, because he had considered the matter of no further consequence. I have considered it of no further consequence also, until this evening. It is of no further consequence now. She held Cordelia's eyes. She said, quietly, You have been misinformed, Miss Marchmont. Whoever brought this letter to your attention, and I do not ask you to name them, brought it to you in the belief that you would use it against my husband in public before he could defend himself. They were mistaken about you, I hope, and mistaken about me. It has always been my habit, Miss Marchmont, to hear a matter from the person it concerns before I hear it from anyone else. It is a habit, I think, that has served me well, and I recommend it to you. She lowered the letter. She did not raise her voice at any point. She said, Now, your mother has, I understand, gone to some expense to have the German band brought from Vauxhall for the 5th dance. Shall we not join it? She turned to Nathaniel. She said, Your Grace. She put her hand in his. He led her, without a word, into the set forming at the top of the room, and the room, watching them cross the floor, understood, in the way a ballroom understands things, that the new Duchess of Ashmere was not a curiosity, and was not a girl who had married up, and was not any of the 6 or 7 things the room had privately called her that autumn. The room understood that she was, plainly and finally, a duchess. Cordelia Marchmont did not follow. Her mother, at the top of the room, whose expression had, for a full minute, gone the color of the wall behind her, put a hand on her daughter's arm. She said, quietly, so that only her daughter could hear, You will apologize to the Duchess of Ashmere before you sleep tonight. You will apologize, in writing, to the Dowager Countess Avellini before you sleep tonight also. And Cordelia, I will not, in this house or in any other, hear you speak of the Duke of Ashmere again. Do you understand me? Cordelia understood her. She had, at that moment, gone entirely white, and her hatred of Louisa Ashmere in her silver-gray silk was, in Louisa's own later phrase, from the Dowager, entirely explainable, though never, in any court of that ballroom, excusable. A hatred that had nothing to do with Louisa and everything to do with a girl who had been in love with a man for 4 years without his knowledge, who had never had her worth publicly said aloud in any room of any house, and who had thought, that evening, that she was at last going to be the woman in the room and had discovered, instead, that she was not. Cordelia did not apologize that night. She apologized in writing the following morning, both to the Duchess of Ashmere and to the Dowager Countess Avellini. Both letters were kept. Neither was answered. The fifth dance at the Marchmont ball was a country dance in 3 parts. The Duke of Ashmere led his wife to the head of the set. He was, in the moment before the music began, aware of a great many things at once. He was aware of the room watching them. He was aware of Cordelia Marchmont's retreating back at the door to the retiring room. He was aware of the Dowager Countess Avellini at the west window, watching him without moving. He was aware of Charlotte Whitcombe standing beside the Dowager with her hand pressed to her mouth. And he was aware, most of all, of the woman opposite him. A woman in silver-gray silk, with no jewelry but the plain gold ring, and a plain ribbon at her throat, who had, in the space of 90 seconds and without raising her voice, walked into the assembled peerage of London and told them what he had not, in 11 years of being the Duke of Ashmere, been able to tell any of them himself. That the Duke of Ashmere was defended. That the Duke of Ashmere was, at last, defended. The music began. He did not dance. He raised his hand, palm out, to the leader of the German band at the top of the room. The music stopped. The room stilled. He said, and his voice was low, but he had, when he needed it, the voice of a man whose family had been the Dukes of Ashmere since the reign of Charles II, and it carried to every corner of the room without effort. He said, "Forgive me, Miss Marchmont and Lady Marchmont, and the assembled company. I shall not, at the present moment, dance. I shall speak, briefly, and then I shall be at my hostess's service for whatever piece of the evening remains. I hope you will forgive me the interruption." He turned to the room. He said, "You have all this evening had the privilege of watching my wife, the Duchess of Ashmere, conduct herself with more dignity in 90 seconds than most of us here manage in 90 years. I do not intend to add to what she said. I intend only to say something she cannot say for herself, because she is my wife, and because it would be ill-becoming of a wife to say it. I intend to say it, and I intend to say it in this ballroom, at this hour, in this company, because I am not so much a fool as to save it for a place where it will be less heard." He turned to her. He looked at her. He said, "I did not choose her for her father's estate. I did not choose her for her family's connections. I did not choose her for her fortune because she had none. I did not choose her for the ballroom's opinion of her, because the ballrooms had not, for 22 years, formed one. I did not choose her for a face the drawing-rooms would remember, because the drawing-rooms had not, until this evening, taken the trouble to see her. I did not choose her because my grandmother told me to, though my grandmother did tell me to, and I owe my grandmother an unpayable debt for it. I did not choose her because she was easy to find, because she was not. I did not choose her because I deserved her, because I did not. I chose her because on the first morning she and I ever met, in her father's yellow parlour in the county of Somersetshire, in the autumn of this year, she came down to the parlour in her plainest grey wool gown, the gown she wore to the ledgers she had been counting since she was 15 years old, and she stood by the sideboard and she told me plainly, in her own house, in front of her father and her sister, that if I was there to look her over, I might look her over as she was, and not as her father would dress her. And I chose her, from that moment onward, because I had never, in 11 years of being what I am, been looked at plainly by any person, and I had never, in 11 years, seen any person look plainly at me either. She did. She did on that morning. She did in the carriage. She did on the gravel in front of my butler when I had lied to her by omission and she found me out. She did last week in a field at Weatherfield, when she told me what my grandfather's steward had known in 1782 and I had not known this morning. She has, every day of the 11 weeks of our marriage, looked at me plainly. It is the rarest gift I have ever been given by any person, and I do not intend, tonight or on any night, to be too proud to say so aloud. You will all, tomorrow morning, say a great many things about my wife. You may say them. I shall not answer them. She will not answer them. But you will say them knowing, from this evening, that the Duke of Ashmere has said, in your hearing, that he was not chosen. He chose. He chose in the plainest gown he was ever offered by any woman. He chose it above every silk in this ballroom. He chose it above every rank in this ballroom. He chose it, and he continues, this evening and every evening, to choose it. He turned back to the room. He said quietly, "That is all. My apologies to the German band. Please, if you would, begin again." The room did not move. The Dowager Countess Avellini moved. She, at the west window, in her black gown and her modest lace cap, brought her two small gloved hands together, once, twice, three times, in a slow, deliberate clap that was audible in every corner of the room. And Charlotte Whitcombe, beside her, took it up, and Lady Marchmont, across the room, at whom no ballroom had ever accused of an unpolitic gesture, took it up too. And in the space of 6 seconds the room was applauding. Not the polite, dutiful clap of a ballroom applauding a hostess, but the loud, released clap of 400 people who had been holding their breath since Cordelia Marchmont crossed the floor and had, at last, been given leave to breathe. Louisa did not weep. She looked at her husband a moment. She said very quietly, so that only he could hear, "Nathaniel." He said, "Louisa." She said, "You have not, I think, ever spoken quite like that before." He said, "I have not, I think, ever had reason to." The music began again. He offered her his hand. She took it. They danced. They left the ball at a little after 2. They did not go up to the drawing-room at Ashmere House. Nathaniel handed Louisa down at the door on Grosvenor Square, and he told the coachman that the carriage was not required again, and he told the butler at the door that they were not to be disturbed, and he took Louisa, still in her silver-grey silk, through the hall and up the shallow stone stairs and into the small library on the first floor, where a fire had been kept up. He closed the door behind them. She stood a moment in the middle of the room. She said, "Nathaniel." He said, "Louisa." She said, "Why did you say all of that in a ballroom, in front of 400 people, before you had said it to me?" He said, "Because I have been the Duke of Ashmere for 11 years, and I know a room. If I had said it to you first, in this house, tonight, alone in this room, you would have believed me, and you would have gone to your grave believing me. But the world would not have believed me, and the world would have gone on, every year of your life, telling you that you had married up and had been chosen for your usefulness, and had been indulged in a small private declaration by a husband who did not, in fact, mean it. I would not have that. I would not have that said in your hearing, at any age, in any drawing-room. So I said it in the ballroom first, so that no room anywhere in England will ever say it again." She looked at him. She said, "You said it there before you said it to me." He said, "Yes." She said, "Say it to me now." He crossed the room. He stood in front of her. He said, "Louisa Whitcombe Ashmere, I chose you. I chose you in the Yellow Parlour, and I chose you at the Register, and I chose you on the gravel, and I chose you at Weatherfield, and I chose you tonight, and I shall, if you will permit it, choose you every morning of the life we are given. I do not ask you to have chosen me on any of those days. I ask you only to let me go on choosing you until such a day as you find you have chosen me back, or until such a day as you have not, at which time I shall abide by the terms of the contract I set at Harrowden, and you will live at your own cost at my cost, with all the freedom the contract allows you, for as long as you require it." She said quietly, "Nathaniel." He waited. She said, "I chose you at Weatherfield." He was still. She said, "I did not know then that I had. I knew this afternoon. I have known since Cordelia Marchmont crossed the floor. I looked at you when she was crossing, and I saw a man about to defend me clumsily and in public, and I understood that I did not wish that man harmed in that room at that hour, and I understood that not wishing a man harmed is a small thing but not a nothing thing, and I understood that I had been not wishing you harm since November. I chose you at Weatherfield. I am telling you now." He said, "Louisa." She said, "I do not, however, require to be chosen every morning of my life. I require to be chosen honestly. I require to be told what is being weighed and what is being paid, and what is being written, and what is being burned, and what is being read. I require the fortnight in October never to be repeated, in any form, at any scale, for any reason. Do you understand me?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Then that is our contract. I do not need a new one written." He said, "You do not." She said, "Then hush, Nathaniel. Come here." He came. She reached up. She put her hand at the side of his face. She looked at him a long moment, and then she did the small, private thing that would, in her own memory afterwards, be the moment of the marriage. Not the vows, not the terms, not the ballroom. She put her forehead against his forehead, and she stood there a full minute without moving, in her silver-grey silk, in the small library of Ashmere House, Grosvenor Square, at 2 o'clock in the morning of the 3rd of December, with a plain gold ring on her hand and a stray dog somewhere in the housekeeper's room asleep on a silk cushion, and she was, at that moment, not invisible to any person in the world. She said, "There. That is done." He said, "That is done." And they went, at last, up to bed. A year later, in the last of the autumn light, Louisa Ashmere sat at the small round table in the small library at Ashmere Court with a household book open in front of her and a stray dog asleep at her feet, and she was, at that moment, 38 weeks and 4 days along in her first pregnancy, and her husband, at the desk in the far corner, was writing a letter to the vicar at Sarnford about the replanting of the hedgerow at Weatherfield, which had, in fact, been done in March and had, in fact, produced its first good crop of oats that summer. The fire was low. Sir Edmund Whitcombe had come up to Ashmere Court for the winter, at Louisa's invitation, at his own protest, and at Mrs. Bassett's insistence. He was sitting, at that hour, in the yellow parlour that had been prepared for him at the east end of the house, with a fresh log on the fire and a cup of tea beside him, and he was, for the first time in 9 years, not afraid of a letter. Charlotte Whitcombe had, in May, been married from Ashmere House on Grosvenor Square to a naval captain of good family and modest fortune, whom she had met at a supper at the Dowager Countess Avellini's house in Bath, and whom she had liked, to her own astonishment, more than the 6 baronets and 2 viscounts who had been in the room at the same time. She wrote her sister once a week from Portsmouth, in a handwriting that had, over the year, become steadier. Louisa answered every letter within 2 days. Cordelia Marchmont had, in February, become engaged to a widowed clergyman with 3 daughters and a living in Northumberland, at some considerable distance from London and Ashmere Court both. She had, in her mother's opinion, been extraordinarily fortunate. She had, in her own opinion, been, at last, saved from her own worst self. She had written Louisa one letter, in the March after the Marchmont ball, which had been 3 lines long and which Louisa had answered in 2, and neither woman had written to the other since. That was, they had both understood, sufficient. The Dowager Countess Avellini had, in October, celebrated her 79th birthday at Ashmere Court, in the small library, at the small round table, with her grandson and her granddaughter-in-law and Mrs. Bassett, whom she insisted on including in family occasions on the grounds that Mrs. Bassett had, over the year, become family in every respect but the name, and she had, on that evening, said quietly to Louisa, over tea, "Child, do you remember the letter I sent you from Bath before the Marchmont ball?" Louisa had said, "Yes, Avellini." The Dowager had said, "Have you kept it?" Louisa had said, "Yes, I have kept it. I have kept it in the small book I have carried in my cloak pocket since I was 15. I put it in the book on the 3rd of December of last year. It is on the 70th line." The Dowager had said, "Read me the 70th line." Louisa had taken the book from the pocket of her afternoon gown. She had turned to the 70th line. She had read it aloud. The 70th line was, "The Dowager Countess Avellini, letter of December 1st, kept for good." The Dowager had said, "Good. Add a 71st. Louisa had said, "What shall the 71st line be?" "Avellini?" The Dowager had said, "The 71st line is, I was seen. Even when I thought I was invisible, I was seen." Louisa had written the 71st line. Now, in the last of the autumn light, a year and a month after the wedding at Nether Harrowden, she was reading the 71st line again, in her own hand, on the 71st line of the small book, in the small library, at the small round table. The fire moved. Her husband, at the desk in the far corner, said, without looking up, "Louisa." She said, "Nathaniel." He said, "Bramble is asleep on my boots. I do not, however, wish to disturb him." She said, "That is a discipline of yours I have come to admire." He said, "It is a discipline you taught me." She looked at the small round table. She looked at her mother's table, which had come from Harrowden in a crate lined with straw in October of the year before, and which had stood, since December, in this room, in this corner, at this fire, with the 2 of them at it every morning for their breakfast and every evening for their tea. She looked at the plain gold ring on her hand. She looked at the household book. She looked at the small book in her lap. She looked at her husband. She looked at the autumn light which was going, and which was, in that room, at that hour, in that year, no longer a creditor. Autumn, at Ashmere Court, that year, had come as a guest. Louisa Ashmere closed the small book. She said, "Nathaniel." There is something else on the 72nd line, but I have not written it yet. I have been waiting. He said, waiting for what? She said, waiting for the light to be exactly like this, in this room, at this table, with you at that desk and me in this chair, at this hour, in the last of the autumn, in the year that is ending. It is like that now. He set his pen down. He came across the room. He sat opposite her at the small round table. He said, Louisa, write the 72nd line. She wrote it. She read it aloud. She said, the 72nd line is, I was seen. And then, at last, I began to see myself. He said quietly, that is a good line, Louisa. She said, it is not mine. It is your grandmother's. I have only borrowed it and finished it. He said, then finish it for her, and for us, and for the girl who will have this ring and this house and this small round table when we are done with them. She said, I will. She closed the book. She put it on the small round table between them. Bramble, on Nathaniel's boots at the desk, sighed in his sleep, and did not stir. If this story has stayed with you, then wait until you hear the story of Eleanor Whitcombe, who wore her mother's old grey gown to a country assembly at Marchmont Hall, and who did not know that the tall stranger who bowed to her first that evening was the Marquis of Sarn. A very different estate, a very different disguise, and a promise a man made in a rainstorm that he could not keep, and had, at last, to keep publicly. That story is coming soon on this channel. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.